The 48 Laws of Power has been banned in American prisons, and once you understand why, nothing about how power works will ever surprise you again. This is Offline Connected, where we decode the books a young, hungry strategist actually reads. Finance, power, persuasion, psychology, the canon. We read them carefully so you can absorb the core in one focus session. What follows is our analysis of the 48 Laws of Power, what we believe the author is really saying, and how it might apply to your life. Find a quiet place, disconnect, and let's decode. This is a whole book breakdown, not one chapter, not a highlight reel. 48 laws, distilled into 3 ideas that run beneath all of them. The primacy of perception over reality, the specific cost of rising too visibly, and the discipline of strategic patience that separates those who accumulate lasting power from those who accumulate temporary wins. Everything else in the book is built on these 3. Robert Greene was a struggling freelance writer in his mid-30s when he began building this book with collaborator Joost Elfers in the mid-1990s. Fired from dozens of jobs across Hollywood, journalism, and European film production, his own explanation was always the same. He had never understood the social architecture of the rooms he walked into. So he began reading obsessively. Machiavelli, Gratian, Sun Tzu, the biographies of Napoleon and Cardinal Richelieu. And over 6 years, a single pattern crystallized from 3,000 years of accumulated evidence. The 48 Laws of Power was the synthesis. When it appeared, critics divided sharply, praised as a landmark of strategic literature, condemned as a guide for manipulators. That division has never fully closed, and that contrast, more than any single review, tells you something important about the kind of knowledge that lives inside it. The first idea, the structural foundation on which everything else in this book rests, is this: power is never about what is real. It is only, always, about what appears to be real. Greene's argument is that the social world operates on a layer of appearances, signals, and impressions that sits above physical reality, and that the person who masters that layer accumulates power regardless of whether they're the most talented or the most deserving person in the room. History does not reward the person who is correct. History rewards the person who controlled how the story was told. This premise is what makes the book uncomfortable for many readers. It means that being genuinely good at what you do is necessary, but never sufficient. What is equally necessary, and what most ambitious people spend their entire careers failing to learn, is the deliberate, disciplined management of how they are perceived by everyone around them. Greene frames this not as manipulation, but as accuracy, an accurate understanding of how the social world actually functions, and of what actually governs who rises and who does not. The most memorable illustration comes in the book's opening chapter. Nicolas Fouquet was the finance minister of France under Louis XIV, brilliant, cultured, politically connected, and spectacularly wealthy. He had built one of the most extraordinary private estates in Europe at Vaux-le-Vicomte, outside Paris. In August of 1661, he invited the king and the entire court to celebrate its completion. And here is where the story becomes instructive. The party that followed was, by every historical account, the most magnificent entertainment France had ever witnessed. 6,000 guests, fireworks that lit the country sky for miles, a world premiere performance of a Molière comedy, a banquet so elaborate it required hundreds of staff to execute. Fouquet stood at the center of it all, radiant, proud, and visibly satisfied with what he had built. 3 weeks later, he was arrested on the personal orders of Louis XIV, charged with embezzlement. Technically accurate, but the charge was a pretext. The real crime was the impression the party had created. Here was a man richer, more refined, more capable of spectacle than the king himself. Louis XIV left Vaux-le-Vicomte that evening humiliated. He went home and began planning Versailles, a monument of retaliatory magnificence that would consume decades of French treasury and thousands of workers' lives. Fouquet died in prison 19 years later, never released. The party had lasted 7 hours. The punishment lasted until his death. His crime was not financial. His crime was the image he created and the feeling it produced in the man above him. Greene opens the book with what he calls the first law: never outshine the master. Always make those above you feel comfortably superior. 13 words. They read as cynical on first encounter. Read them slowly, without defensiveness, and they become something more precise, a description of the social physics governing nearly every hierarchical relationship in recorded history. Fouquet never absorbed that law. The cost was everything he had built. Think about the last time you were genuinely proud of something you had accomplished, and the person you most wanted to share it with happened to be someone whose own achievements were older, smaller, or less recent than yours. If you showed them fully, without softening the magnitude of what you had done, and then something shifted afterward, a subtle cooling, a new distance in how that person engaged with you, you are not the victim of their smallness. You were experiencing the exact dynamic Greene catalogs across 3,000 years of court history. The lesson is not to permanently conceal what you are capable of. The lesson is that understanding why that shift happened requires first accepting that other people's egos are real forces in the world, as real as gravity and equally indifferent to whether you think they should exist. You can disagree with the fact of them. That disagreement does not make them less operational. The social world runs on its own logic, regardless of whether you have consented to play by it. But here's where it gets interesting. Greene is not advocating for dishonesty. He is not telling you to hide your gifts or perform inadequacy. He is describing a social operating system that most educated, well-intentioned people spend their entire careers refusing to acknowledge, and then wonder, quietly, why the system keeps producing outcomes they did not expect and did not deserve. Perception is not superficial. It is the substrate on which every organization, every relationship, and every system of human power is constructed. Managing your perceived image with the same discipline you bring to your actual performance is not vanity or deception. It is accuracy, an accurate reading of how human beings are actually built and of what actually governs outcomes in social environments. That is the first idea. The second makes it considerably harder to look away from. The second idea is about the specific mechanism by which rising, ambitious, visible, accelerating rising destroys the people who do it carelessly. Greene argues that the most consistently fatal mistake made by capable, talented individuals throughout history is not incompetence. It is overexposure. Rising too quickly, accumulating too much influence, too much wealth, too much visibility, before those above them have decided that the rise is safe and serves their interests. He identifies a recurring character across his case studies: the brilliant courtier, the gifted subordinate, the exceptional employee, whose singular mistake is becoming so clearly capable that their patron begins asking a question the patron never says aloud. Do I still control this person, or are they beginning to outgrow me? Once that question is asked inside a power structure, the answer almost always takes the same form. The relationship ends. The patronage is withdrawn. The brilliant courtier is managed not as a rising star, but as a threat. This pattern appears with such consistency across Greene's 3,000 years of evidence that it ceases to feel like biography and begins to feel like a structural law of social physics. Greene's historical range is vast, but one of the most instructive examples of this dynamic is Galileo's navigation of the Italian court system in the early 17th century. Galileo was prolific, brilliant, and perpetually underfunded, working at the edge of what natural philosophy could do, always short of the resources and protection that would let him work freely. He understood, in a way unusual for scientists of his era, that discovery alone was not enough. And this is where his story separates from Fouquet's. When he confirmed the Copernican model using his telescope, he did not simply publish the findings and wait for recognition. He made a deliberate political calculation first. He named the 4 moons of Jupiter the Medicean stars, after the ruling family of Florence, and framed the discovery as a tribute to his patron Cosimo II Medici, rather than as a personal triumph. The discovery became Cosimo's discovery. The glory was directed upward before Galileo claimed any of it for himself. The reward was immediate and concrete: a court position, a steady salary, and the sustained protection of one of the most powerful families in Europe. That protection bought him years of productive research that would otherwise have been spent chasing funds and navigating institutions that found his conclusions inconvenient. Greene's reading of this story is not that Galileo was being manipulative. He was being accurate about the system he was operating inside. Intellectual discovery happens inside social structures. Those structures reward deference and the deliberate elevation of patrons as much as they reward the quality of the work itself. Galileo understood this, acted accordingly, and survived long enough to produce the work that made him permanent. Fouquet understood none of it. Greene writes from Law 46, "Appearing better than others is always dangerous, but most dangerous of all is to appear to have no faults or weaknesses." That line is not an argument for false modesty or performed inadequacy. It is an observation about how superiority, even genuine, warranted superiority, reads as a form of aggression inside a hierarchy. The person above you does not experience your excellence as an asset to manage. They experience it as a quiet question about their own necessity. Think of the person in your organization, or in your field, or in your social circle, who is genuinely the most capable. Not the most liked, not the most politically adroit, but the most technically skilled, the one who produces the best work by the clearest margin. Now ask yourself honestly, are they the most powerful person in that environment? In most cases, the answer is no, and Greene gives you a precise framework for understanding why, not as a complaint about fairness, but as a description of how the system actually operates. Somewhere in that person's history, they rose too fast and alarmed someone above them, or made the wrong person feel diminished, or simply never considered that talent needs to be managed politically, not just developed technically. The excellence was real. The political architecture around it was absent, and the system, indifferent to excellence alone, produced the outcome it always produces when that architecture is missing. And this is the part nobody wants to hear. The evidence Greene assembles is not selective or constructed for effect. He draws from the Roman Empire, from Renaissance Italy, from the courts of Versailles, from the Chinese imperial dynasties, from the careers of Napoleon, Talleyrand, Bismarck, and the Borgia, and the same architecture appears in every case, separated by centuries and cultures, but not by internal logic. The powerful protect their position by controlling who rises and at what rate. The ambitious survive by making their ascent feel, to those above them, like a benefit rather than a competition. When that implicit agreement breaks, when the rising person stops managing upward and begins competing openly, the outcome is predictable and almost never favors the challenger regardless of talent, moral standing, or justified grievance. That is the second idea, and the third tells you what to do about it. The third idea is the one that separates the 48 laws of power from every other book about ambition, because the final argument Greene makes is not an argument for aggression. It is an argument for patience. And this is where the argument gets counterintuitive. Greene demonstrates, across dozens of laws and hundreds of case studies, that the defining characteristic of the people who accumulate lasting power is not boldness. It is selectivity, knowing when to act and when to wait, when to display capability and when to conceal it entirely, when to press with force and when to hold perfectly still. He frames this as the mastery of timing, and it runs through everything from his laws about deception and court maneuvering to his laws about war, negotiation, and influence sustained over decades. The person who moves at the right moment, against the right target, with the right calibration of force or restraint, that person accumulates power over time. The person who reacts emotionally, who reveals intentions too early, who attacks before the ground has been fully prepared, that person almost always loses, regardless of how substantial their talent or resources happen to be. The laws about timing and patience are not the most dramatic in the book. They are the most important. The historical figure who best embodies this third idea, and who appears more consistently in Greene's body of work than almost any other, is Cardinal Richelieu, chief minister of France under Louis XIII in the early 17th century. Richelieu was not born into power. He came from a minor, noble family, entered the church as an economic necessity, and spent years working his way into the orbit of the French court through patient, carefully calibrated positioning. What made Richelieu exceptional was not his intelligence. The French court was full of intelligent people. It was his restraint. When he first entered the inner circle of Louis XIII, he did not display ambition. He made himself useful, quietly, consistently, without alarming the existing power structure. He studied the court, understood who needed what and who feared whom, and identified with precision the moment when the king would need him badly enough that elevation would feel like relief rather than threat. He waited for that moment without appearing to wait. Then he moved. Once installed at the center of French power, he was systematic and decisive, but never erratic, never visibly emotional. He dismantled the political power of the French nobility through a sequence of moves so carefully timed and precisely sequenced that by the time his opponents fully understood what was happening, the game was already over. He did not attack his enemies when he felt the pressure to do so. He attacked them when they were most exposed and he was most secure. Greene's lesson from Richelieu is not, be cruel. The lesson is, be deliberate. Understand the room before you move in it. Wait until the conditions are right. Then act, completely and without hesitation, not 1 second before. The patience that makes that possible is not weakness. It is the most dangerous discipline in the entire book. From Law 35, Greene writes, "Never seem to be in a hurry. Hurrying betrays a lack of control over yourself and over time." Read that as scheduling advice, and you have missed it entirely. Read it as a description of what accumulated power looks and feels like from the outside, what it signals to every person in the room, and it becomes something considerably harder to dismiss. Think about the last decision you made under emotional pressure. The email sent before you were ready to send it. The job resigned before the next one was secured. The confrontation forced before you held any actual leverage in the situation. The loss in each of those cases was not the decision itself. It was the timing. You acted at the moment the discomfort was most acute, which is precisely the moment Greene identifies across 300 pages of historical evidence as the least reliable moment for action. Emotional urgency and strategic opportunity almost never arrive simultaneously. The feeling that you must move now is, in his framework, almost always a signal that now is the wrong moment. The discipline Greene describes is simple to articulate and nearly impossible to execute without a framework that makes the cost of premature action visible before you pay it. Which is exactly why he spent 6 years and 300 pages building the historical case before asking you to apply it. So what does that actually mean for you? Strategic patience is not passivity. It is not avoidance. And it is not procrastination wrapped in the language of deliberateness. It is a genuine, active discipline. The practice of waiting until conditions are precisely right, and then acting completely and without hesitation. If you compress the entire architecture of this book into a single operating instruction, it is this: understand the room before you move in it. Know who needs what, who fears whom, who is ascending and who is losing ground. Know what impression you are creating and whether it actually serves your position. Then move at the right moment, in the right direction, with exactly the calibration the situation requires. That is the third idea, and the one that makes the other two worth knowing. In the mid-1990s, a young man from the Marcy Houses public housing project in Brooklyn was trying to release his first record album. Every major label he approached turned him down. The conventional path, audition, pitch, wait for the gatekeepers to grant approval, was not working. So he did something that had not been done at commercial scale before. He co-founded his own record label, pressed his own records, and sold them directly from the trunk of a car in front of corner stores. He built demand from the street up before any gatekeeper had a chance to define what he was or was not. He manufactured his own inevitability. That man was Jay-Z. And the story of how he moved from Marcy Houses to a documented net worth above $1 billion is a case study in every idea this book contains. Not as metaphor, but as a literal application of the same dynamics Greene traces through Richelieu and Galileo and Fouquet. He did not outshine his early partners and patrons. He made them profitable while he learned the business, the law, and the leverage points. He waited on major partnerships, signing deals that gave him less money in the short term in exchange for more control over the long term. He managed perception with obsessive precision. Every album title, every business partnership, every element of his public image was deliberate. Nothing about how he presented himself was accidental. He never moved in a room without understanding it first. And when he had accumulated enough stored patience, enough resources, enough relationships and leverage, he moved decisively and all at once. Rockefeller Records, then Rocawear, then Tidal, then a champagne label, then art acquisition at museum scale. Each move built on the last. None of them were reactive. The pattern is identical to what Greene describes. Accumulate quietly. Make your patrons wealthy before you surpass them, and reveal your full capability only once the ground beneath you is solid enough to hold the weight of it. He has said in interviews that he read this book until specific passages became instinctive rather than theoretical, until the framework was no longer something he consulted, but something he inhabited. The book did not make him successful. What it gave him was language, a precise vocabulary for a framework he had already been developing through lived experience. And once you have language for a framework, you can refine it, teach it, and apply it to new situations faster than intuition alone ever allows. That is what Greene was building. Not a guide for villains, a vocabulary for the social physics that govern all of us, whether we choose to study them or not. Of the three ideas in this book, the one with the highest immediate return, the one you can begin applying this week without any preparation at all, is the first, perception management. Not because it is the most important in the long run. Strategic patience, the third idea, is ultimately what determines who accumulates lasting power versus who wins individual battles and exhausts themselves doing it. But perception management is the idea that costs you nothing and begins working the moment you engage with it deliberately. This week, before you walk into any room that matters, a meeting, a negotiation, a conversation with someone above you in any hierarchy, ask yourself one question first. What does this person or group need to believe about me for this interaction to go well? Not who do I want to be? Not what is factually accurate about my performance or my intentions. What do they need to perceive specifically in this specific room at this specific moment? Then make sure your behavior supports that perception through deliberateness, not performance. By choosing which parts of yourself to lead with, when to speak and when to let someone else hold the floor, when to display what you know and when to let someone above you feel like the most informed person in the room. Most people leave their reputation entirely to chance, to the unmanaged interpretations of their behavior by other people, unconsidered and uncontrolled. That is the specific error this book is most urgently trying to correct. Read it once to understand what Greene is saying. Read it a second time to understand what he is describing. The gap between those two readings is where the real work begins. The book that has been removed from prison library shelves, the one passed quietly between ambitious people who are not entirely comfortable admitting they have read it, is not, at its core, a manual for cruelty or manipulation. It is a mirror, and what it shows you, if you're willing to look without flinching, is how little of the social world around you have been seeing clearly, and how much energy you have spent operating as though the rules that govern power simply do not apply to someone with your intentions, your education, your sense of what is fair. They do. They always have. Greene's contribution was to write them down in one place, without apology and without consolation. The next decode is on The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli, the book that Robert Greene himself has called the original blueprint, written 500 years before this one, by the man who first looked at power without flinching and refused to look away. One question for the comments. Which of the 48 laws do you think is the most dangerous to violate? And have you ever watched someone destroy a career or a relationship by breaking it?